George Washington is the father of our country. His face is carved into Mount Rushmore and printed on every single dollar bill. He was the general who took on the world's greatest empire and won. He was the president who walked away from power when he could have been king. But behind that stone-faced image lived a painful irony. The man called the father of his country could never have children of his own. His body denied him what nature gave to every simple farmer. Every morning, he snapped dentures into his mouth made from the teeth of his own slaves, bought for 122 shillings. Steel springs poked into his gums, forcing his jaw shut and giving him that grim expression we see on the dollar bill. Now, 2 centuries later, modern genetics and DNA testing from 2024 have pulled back the curtain on what Washington hid under layers of powder and formal portraits. By analyzing remains from the Harewood Cemetery and tracking the chromosomes of his collateral descendants, we finally know why the biological line of America's most powerful man ended with him. Who was this man, really? A man whose temper made walls shake. What was the curse hidden in his cells that left him without an heir? And what ancient blood ran through his veins, driving him to fight a superpower when the odds were stacked against him? To understand the secret in his DNA, we have to go back to his bedroom at Mount Vernon on a cold December night in 1799.
But first, if you can hit that like button in the next 3 seconds, it shows you love your mom. And if you subscribe to the channel, it means you love your entire family.
Behind those closed doors, away from the cheering crowds and gold-framed portraits, George Washington stopped being a marble god. He was an exhausted man obsessed with the smallest details. His life was a victory of sheer will over a failing body. When you look at his daily life, it's clear every habit was an attempt to keep control in a world where his health betrayed him every day. The general's day started at 4 a.m., long before the sun came up. In the dim light of tallow candles, he began a ritual that felt like preparing for battle. His biggest enemy was his teeth. By his 1789 inauguration, the father of his country had only one natural tooth left. The rest were replaced with dentures made of ivory, lead, and real human teeth. A ledger at Mount Vernon has a grim entry: by cash paid Negroes for 9 teeth, 122 shillings. He bought teeth from his slaves and fit them into dentures held together by gold springs. Those springs were always trying to pop out, forcing him to keep his lips pressed tight. Think about that. Every word he spoke took massive physical effort just to keep his jaw from springing open. That constant struggle shaped his mouth into that thin, hard line we all recognize as iron-willed determination. He cleaned those dentures constantly. He always carried special scrapers and burnt bread powder in his travel bags, but the pain never went away. This is why he loved soft food. His favorite cornmeal hoe cakes were cooked until they were light as air, then practically drowned in honey and butter. While he built institutions in politics, at Mount Vernon he built a perfect system of order. His obsession with managing his estate was extreme. Washington personally rode across all 5 of his farms, nearly 8,000 acres every single morning.
He didn't just check the work, he tracked every penny and every pound. His journals show exactly how many stakes were in a fence and the precise depth of a plow line in the west field. He made his workers count seeds. When he ordered farming books from England, he demanded a report on the delivery of every single page. This need for order was his shield. His blood carried the ancient fire of his Celtic ancestors from the R1b152 haplogroup. But in his ledgers, everything was perfect. If he could control the wheat harvest, he was still the master of his fate, despite the fact that he could never have a son. Washington was the tallest man in any room, 6'2", with broad shoulders and massive hands. He knew he was physically imposing and used it to his advantage. Yet behind that power was a deep shyness. He ordered his clothes only from London catalogs, asking for the best quality but no frills. He hated when people got too familiar. In an era when people were starting to hug and shake hands, Washington made the cold, formal bow popular again. He didn't want to be touched. Maybe he was afraid that if people got too close, they would smell his decaying teeth or see the deep smallpox scars he hid under thick layers of powder. His silence at meetings was the stuff of legend. While other delegates at the Continental Congress spent hours arguing over taxes, Washington sat perfectly still, his back straight as a rod. People mistook this for deep wisdom. In reality, he was terrified to open his mouth. One wrong move and his dentures could slip, triggering the stutter that had haunted him his entire life. His greatness was built on a silence forced by physical pain. One of the most striking things about him was the constant war he waged against his own temper. As a young man, he painstakingly copied 110 rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation. Rule number 22 said, "Show no sign of joy at the misfortune of another, though he were your enemy." He trained himself like a wild animal, but every now and then, the beast broke loose. Officers remembered the Battle of Monmouth, where Washington caught General Lee in a shameful retreat. Those standing nearby said Washington cursed so loud the leaves on the trees shook. His face turned purple, the veins in his neck bulged, and his eyes became icy slits. In those moments, his true nature came out, the warrior of the R1b152 haplogroup, whose ancestors survived the harsh Alps 4,500 years ago by crushing skulls with stone axes. But as soon as the flash of anger passed, the mask went back on. He would return to his tent, pick up his pen, and with obsessive care, record exactly how much he'd spent on gunpowder. His marriage to Martha was his only refuge, but even that was poisoned by the knowledge that his biological line was a dead end. Martha was a wealthy widow with children, and Washington genuinely loved them. But every time he watched his stepchildren grow, he saw exactly what he would never have. The archives at Mount Vernon show his painful obsession with genealogy. He ordered research into his family tree back in England, trying to find a link to knights and lords. He was looking in the past for what he couldn't pass on to the future.
Even his habit of buying lottery tickets felt like a desperate attempt to beat the odds. He spent hundreds of pounds on lotteries, hoping for a stroke of luck, as if, deep down, he knew he'd drawn a blank in life's ultimate biological lottery. His house was full of other men's children. His mouth was full of other men's teeth. His life was dedicated to building a future for other people's families. Once, while watching his great-nephews play in the garden, he wrote a line in his diary that was later almost entirely crossed out. "A man may raise a monument of stone, but only a son is a monument of flesh. Without him, we are but shadows fading into the twilight." These words, written by a man who had just won a war against the most powerful empire on earth, sound like a cry of pure despair. Washington created an image that was impossible to break. He became a living statue, a perfect machine. But this machine ran on the edge of its limits, fueled by opium tinctures and Portuguese Madeira. He turned his weaknesses into a myth and his infertility into a political weapon. Since the father of the nation could never start his own dynasty, he could never become a tyrant. But what if he had known that his infertility wasn't a curse from the gods, but the result of one fateful trip to Barbados? What if he'd known that the blood in his veins didn't belong to English aristocrats, but to wild mountain tribes from the Alps? To understand how these two things, his ancient blood and a Caribbean infection, collided to create the man on the dollar bill, we have to look inside his cells. we have to trace a microscopic tuberculosis bacteria that in 1751 began its slow destruction of young George's body. It forever closed the door to ordinary happiness, but opened the path to immortality. Behind Washington's greatness, behind every victory on the battlefield or in the halls of Congress, there was a shadow he couldn't escape. It was the conflict between his image as the new Adam, the creator of a whole new world, and his own inability to give life to a single heir. In the 18th century, when a man's success was measured by his bloodline, Washington's infertility wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a target for spies, a subject of cruel gossip, and a deep, lifelong crisis. Philadelphia in the late 1870s was a shark tank of intrigue. While the Founding Fathers were writing the Constitution, people in taverns and private offices weren't just debating the law. They were whispering about the fitness of the man who was supposed to lead the nation. John Adams, a man with a sharp tongue and an even sharper ambition, didn't hold back in his private letters to Benjamin Rush. He often used double-edged words when talking about Washington. He called him a statue without a spark, and hinted that the general's coldness wasn't stoicism, it was a sign of some inner shortcoming. Adams, who took great pride in his many children, saw Washington's infertility as a mark of divine disapproval. In one biting letter, he wrote, "Nature gave him the height and the posture, but forgot to give him that vital energy that makes a man a part of history's future." For Washington's political enemies, his childlessness was a convenient weapon.
In an era when the idea of a monarchy still lingered in American minds, rumors swirled that Washington was intentionally avoiding having children so he wouldn't be tempted to start a royal dynasty. But behind that noble myth was a much harsher reality. Thomas Jefferson, a keen observer and often a silent critic, wrote in his diary after a dinner at Mount Vernon, "There is order in the general's house, but there is no noise. It is a museum house where time has stopped. Nature has denied him what she gives so freely to the poorest farmer on his land." These weren't just observations, they were a verdict. In a world that didn't yet know about DNA, infertility was seen as either a woman's fault or a man's shame. Washington had to carry that shame while the entire nation watched. The main witness to this struggle was Martha Washington. Their 1759 marriage seemed like the perfect match, a wealthy widow and an ambitious colonel. Martha had already proven she could have children. She'd had 4 from her first marriage to Daniel Parke Custis. The facts were plain. Since there were no children in this new marriage, the issue was George. Martha never blamed her husband publicly. She was his faithful partner, staying with him in the Continental Army's winter camps, mending soldiers' uniforms and hosting ambassadors. But in her letters to her sister, Elizabeth, a deep sadness leaked out. In 1761, she wrote, "My dear George often stands by the window, staring out at the fields for a long time. I know what is on his mind. The Lord blessed me with motherhood before, but it seems he has decided that the cup of our union shall remain empty." By the 1770s, hope had vanished. Martha tried every 18th century remedy she could find, from strange herbal teas to healing springs in Virginia. Washington dutifully paid the apothecary bills, but every year his ledger entries grew colder. He stopped buying children's items for the future and started pouring massive amounts of money into the education of his stepchildren, Jackie and Patsy. The drama only deepened when both of Martha's children died young. Patsy died of an epileptic seizure right in front of her stepfather, and Jackie died of camp fever during the siege of Yorktown. A man with no children of his own lost the ones he had raised as his own. He stood alone at the peak of his fame, with no biological legacy to leave behind. In medical circles then and for decades after, the debate raged. What exactly had broken in the body of the Virginia giant? Some of his contemporaries, seeing his incredible height, wide hips, and lack of facial hair,
He was always clean-shaven, but some said his beard grew very slowly. Suspected a birth defect. In the 20th century, medical historians seriously debated whether he had Klinefelter syndrome. Men with this condition are often tall, have a specific body shape, and are almost always infertile. For a long time, this was the favorite hidden theory among historians. It explained his calm nature, his physical proportions, and his childlessness. The tension was powerful. Could the ultimate symbol of American manhood be biologically less than a man? However, the 2024 genetic analysis, using DNA from his male relatives at the Harewood Cemetery, crushed that theory. The Washington Y chromosome was perfectly normal. The study confirmed the R1b U152 haplogroup. This was the DNA of a warrior. The cause of his tragedy wasn't something he was born with. It was something he caught. The war with his own biology started in 1751. It was the only time George ever left North America. He traveled to Barbados with his half-brother, Lawrence, who was slowly dying of tuberculosis. George hoped the sea air and tropical sun would save his brother. He didn't know the trip would kill his own chance at fatherhood. In Barbados, 19-year-old George caught smallpox. He wrote briefly in his diary, was strongly attacked. He survived, though his face was scarred for life. But smallpox was just a distraction. By being in constant contact with his coughing, sick brother in cramped ship cabins and small rented rooms, George inhaled tuberculosis bacteria. Young George was strong with a powerful immune system, thanks to those alpine Celtic genes, so the TB didn't destroy his lungs right away. Instead, the infection went stealth, moving through his lymphatic system. It struck his most vulnerable spot, his reproductive organs. In the 18th century, doctors couldn't diagnose this. They called it inflammation or a stagnation of bad humors. For Washington, it meant weeks of agonizing pain, high fever, and swelling that he, as a gentleman, refused to discuss even with doctors. The infection literally burned away his ability to have children. The tissue was replaced by scars.
Imagine the internal conflict of this young man. He returns to Virginia, full of ambition, wanting to build a family and an empire, only to the chance has already slipped away. The most powerful emotional explosion of this conflict is hidden on a yellowed piece of paper in the Mount Vernon archives. In 1784, right after the Revolutionary War ended, Washington wrote to an old friend. There's a section in that letter that the general later tried to cross out so violently the ink almost turned into a black hole. Modern technology has allowed us to read what was hidden. It said, "The world sees me as a winner and the father of liberty, but when I return to my room, I see only emptiness. I have built a house where no one will light the fire after I am gone. My name will stay on paper, but it will vanish from the blood. This is the price I pay for the Lord trusting me with the fate of millions while taking away the fate of one." This was his moment of truth. Washington realized his infertility wasn't just a medical fact, it was part of his historical purpose. If he'd had a son, America might never have become a republic. The temptation to pass power to an heir was too strong for men in those days. His biological tragedy became the guarantee of American freedom. The conflict reaches its peak in a scientific contradiction. His haplogroup, R1b U152, is the marker of men who physically dominated Europe for thousands of years. These are the genes of the alpha males of the Bronze Age, men who spread their DNA at an incredible rate. Washington had every physical trait of this genetic group: incredible strength, endurance, and that volcanic anger he worked so hard to keep under wraps. His entire life was an attempt to make up for his biological failure. He became the father of the nation because he couldn't be the father of a child. He poured all that unused paternal energy into building the institutions of our government. His obsession with rules, his strict etiquette, and his focus on every tiny detail of the army, it was all a way to channel that loss. Every soldier was his son. Every new mile of American soil was his legacy. But how do we know this for sure? Washington never allowed doctors to perform a detailed exam, let alone an autopsy that would have revealed the truth. The secret was buried with him in 1799 under a marble slab. However, in March 2024, science did what was impossible for 2 centuries. Geneticists didn't disturb the rest of the general. Instead, they went to the abandoned Harewood Cemetery, where the same blood lay beneath the weeds and the dust of time. The biggest problem for any genetic researcher is Mount Vernon itself. The first president's tomb is a national shrine. No one is ever going to open the casket of the man who is America just to take a bone sample. It seemed like his genetic code would stay a mystery forever, but genetics has a loophole. The Y chromosome. It's passed from father to son almost perfectly, like a family crest stamped into every cell. To crack George's code, you don't need George. You just need his direct male relatives who shared the same father. In March 2024, a team of forensic anthropologists and experts in ancient DNA headed to that forgotten cemetery in West Virginia. There, among the leaning headstones covered in wild ivy, lay the remains of Samuel Washington, George's younger brother, and his descendants. The exhumation looked like a surgery. Archaeologists wore full protective suits to make sure they didn't contaminate the ancient samples with modern DNA. When they pulled fragments of jaw and teeth from the president's great-nephews, Corbin and George Steptoe Washington, they knew they had the golden key. The remains had been in the ground for nearly 150 years. Soil acid, moisture, and bacteria had turned most of the DNA into molecular junk. But inside the tooth enamel and the thick parts of the skull, tiny pieces of the original text survived. In the lab, the bone fragments were ground into a fine dust. Using chemicals, scientists dissolved the bone to release the precious DNA strands. It was like trying to rebuild a library from the scraps of burned books.
Each piece was short, only 30 or 40 letters long. Using a method called shotgun sequencing, supercomputers began to piece these millions of fragments together. In the quiet of the server rooms, a miracle happened. The Washington family Y chromosome began to appear, like a hidden image on old film. When the algorithms finished, the scientists saw a pattern of mutations on their screens that left no doubt. This wasn't a typical Anglo-Saxon code. This was a code that led straight to the heart of Europe. The history books say the Washingtons were classic English gentlemen from Northamptonshire. Their ancestors owned Sulgrave Manor and were loyal subjects of the crown. Geneticists expected to see the R1b L21 haplogroup, which is common in the British Isles. Instead, the results showed something else. R1b U152, also known as S28. This genetic marker is the calling card of Italo-Celtic tribes. Its epicenter is in the Alps. This is the DNA of people who dominated Switzerland, northern Italy, and southern Germany 4,500 years ago during the Bronze Age. This was the Latin culture, the cradle of Celtic civilization. What does this mean for the image of Washington? It means his veins held the blood of people who fought Roman legions and had an incredible ability to survive extreme cold and scarce resources. His ancestors weren't native Britons, they were conquerors and migrants. Most likely, they reached England either with Roman auxiliary troops or during later Celtic migrations. They brought more than just swords to England. They brought a biological toughness forged in the mountains. Now that scientists have his full genetic profile, many mysteries of Washington's life finally make sense. The R1b U152 haplogroup often goes hand in hand with a certain body type, a massive frame and high muscle density. Washington didn't just happen to be tall. He had a power written into his genes. His ability to survive conditions that killed everyone else doesn't seem like just divine providence anymore. Think back to 1755 and the Battle of the Monongahela. 2 horses were shot out from under him. His coat was ripped by 4 different bullets, but not one touched his skin. Historians called it magical luck. Geneticists see it differently. His reflexes, his nervous system, and his ability to stay ice cold in the middle of a massacre, that was his alpine DNA at work. The genes of Celtic warriors, for whom battle was a natural state, gave him a level of stress resistance that most people simply don't have. Yet this same genetic line carried a hidden vulnerability. Research shows that certain branches of the R1b U152 group can have a specific hyperreactive immune response to mycobacteria. While studying his haplogroup, medical experts re-examined Washington through the lens of modern science. In 1751, on that trip to Barbados, George was hit with a double whammy. Smallpox wrecked his immune system, and the tuberculosis he caught from his brother Lawrence found a back door. In the 2024 analysis of the bones from Harewood, scientists went looking for traces of Mycobacterium tuberculosis DNA, and they found it. This confirmed an old theory. Washington suffered from systemic tuberculosis. The infection settled in his reproductive system. Tuberculosis of the kidneys and groin was a death sentence for a man's future in the 18th century. The bacteria slowly destroyed his system, causing chronic inflammation. The notes from Washington's personal doctor, James Craik, about a painful swelling that the general refused to let anyone examine finally make sense. It wasn't a birth defect, it was a living infection that struck America's greatest hero when he was just 19 years old. But the most shocking discovery came at the very end of the study. When Washington's profile was compared to other historical figures, the computer flagged a match. It turns out that Abraham Lincoln, the man who saved the Union 60 years after Washington died, had deep genetic roots in that same alpine soil. Even though their family lines split thousands of years ago, they both carried the code of those ancient U152 warriors. The 2 pillars of American history were biological brothers in arms. One was a tall, athletic, aristocratic warrior. The other was a moody, wiry giant from a log cabin. Both were unusually tall. Both had a will of steel, and both were ready to sacrifice everything for an idea. It's not just a coincidence, it's the work of the same genetic engine that kicks into gear during history's most desperate moments. The March 2024 study didn't stop with the dead. Geneticists analyzed the DNA of over 5,000 modern Americans with the last name Washington or who claimed to be related.
They found people living in trailer parks in Ohio, working in New York banks, and farming in Iowa. Many of them carried that same R1b152 haplogroup. When they were told their blood was identical to the first president's, the reaction was always the same: total shock. One mechanic from Virginia said, "I always felt this anger inside and this strange need to keep everything in order. Now I know it's not just me. It's the Alps in me." The 2024 genetic reveal did what Washington's enemies couldn't do during his lifetime. It stripped away the mask of the English lord and showed the ancient Celtic warrior whose body was broken by disease. We know for sure now, Washington could not have children. We know his male line is the result of a 4,500-year journey from the snowy peaks of Europe to the forests of Virginia. But this knowledge leaves us with an even deeper question. If his immortality isn't in his blood, if his genes died with him in that cold bedroom, what exactly did he leave us? What if father of his country isn't just a metaphor, but the greatest example in history of an idea completely defeating biology? Now that we have his code, we can look at the events of 1799 in a new light. On that fatal December night, Washington rode his horse through freezing rain and snow for 5 hours.
His clothes were soaked through, but being the man of habit he was, he sat down for dinner without changing. By the next morning, his throat had swollen shut. He was suffocating. The doctors, following the brutal medical practices of the time, drained nearly 5 pints of his blood, more than half the blood in a grown man's body. Any other 67-year-old would have died of shock after the first bowl. But Washington held on for 21 hours. It wasn't a miracle, it was his alpine engine. His heart and lungs, toughened by ancestors who lived through high altitudes and extreme physical stress, fought until the very last beat. The blood the doctors were pouring away carried the same code of resilience as the warriors who survived the Gaelic wars. His body was a perfect survival machine, and that's what makes his infertility even more tragic. Nature created a perfect specimen, strong, smart, and incredibly tough, and then denied him the ability to pass it on. It brings us back to the question, what makes a man a father if he can't have children? Washington found the answer by building a country. He took that fatherly instinct and poured it into the nation. His infertility became a political superpower. In the late 1700s, the world still thought in terms of kings. If a leader was successful, he wanted to give his power to his son, but Washington had no son. This created a unique moment in history. He had no one to build a throne for. His alpine rage and his drive to dominate were redirected into the boundaries of the Republic. In 1783, when his officers were angry at Congress and offered to make him King of America, Washington shut them down with such fury that he made those hardened soldiers cry in shame. Most see this as a great act of civic virtue, but modern science adds another layer. He walked away from the crown because he knew no one could wear it after him. His biological dead end was the salvation of American democracy. History tried to dress Washington up as a polite British gentleman, but the 2024 DNA test tore off the wig. His ancestors weren't stuffy lords, they were free-spirited Celts who hated rigid hierarchies. The Celtic tribes of the Alps lived by a system of free warriors and elected chiefs. That genetic memory was sleeping in him for centuries until it woke up in Virginia. When Washington stepped down after 2 terms, he did something King George III called the most incredible thing of the century. Biologically, he was acting like an alpine chief. He protected the tribe, finished the job, and walked away. His legacy isn't a name in a family tree, it's the Constitution, which works like the genetic code of a society, passing on survival information without needing a drop of blood. Today, when millions of Americans call themselves children of liberty, they are the biological carriers of the ideas of a man who couldn't conceive a single child. His obsession with order, those ledgers where he tracked every single cent, was his way of proving he existed. If he couldn't see himself in a son's eyes, he would see himself in the perfect accuracy of his books and the solid borders of his country. When we look at Mount Rushmore today, we aren't just looking at the first president. We are looking at a man who defeated his own DNA. His alpine ancestors survived the mountains, so he could survive the fire of revolution and the cold of personal loneliness.
George Washington died on December 14, 1799. His last words were, "'Tis well." Did he feel that his mission to cheat death was finally complete? Have you ever taken a DNA test to see whose blood is actually in your veins? Do you know where your people really came from? Your chromosomes are the most accurate record on the planet. There's no room for politics or family myths there. Unlike history books, which can be rewritten, DNA keeps the truth in every cell. Today, a simple cheek swab can wipe away centuries of tall tales. George Washington spent his life thinking he was an English gentleman, but his genes told a story of an alpine warrior. Genetics opens a door to a world where you aren't just a name, you are the heir to a massive ancient migration. Your legacy is more than a portrait on a wall. It's a living history forged in battles and survival. Washington couldn't pass his blood to his children, but he passed his grit to an entire nation. What story does your blood tell? If you want the truth about your roots, subscribe to the channel. In the next episode, we'll dive into the story of the most photographed woman of the 20th century, whose life inside the royal family was a total genetic trap.